So welcome. This is a Zoom discussion on the question of whether New Zealand can create a low emissions national public transport network, and if so, how. So we're focusing very much on the context of transport emissions, which, as you know, constitute something in the vicinity of 40% of total carbon dioxide emissions and around 20% of overall emissions, depending on the global warming potential measure that's used. And we are operating in a context where we know globally we need to reduce our overall carbon dioxide emissions by around 45 to 50% by 2030 if we're to have any reasonable chance of avoiding more than 1.5 degrees of warming, and then go to zero net carbon dioxide emissions by 2050 at the latest, and then negative net emissions. So I'd like to begin by just thanking Paul Callister for setting up this, this Zoom discussion, and also for being willing to contribute as one of 6 esteemed contributors. If I could just briefly mention a few administrative matters, then I'll introduce the speakers and then we'll get straight underway. So you're welcome to be visible or not through your video, but it is nice to see people. But I appreciate you may be coming and going, and if you want to turn your videos off, that's fine. Please remain muted while people are speaking, but there will be an opportunity later, obviously, for you to contribute verbally. This discussion is being recorded, so well, it should be recorded. It doesn't. Yes, it is recording, it says, so that's good. Please feel free to use the chat function during the presentations, and it may well be that we can get some answers during the presentations, not by the presenter who's speaking, but by others. And please, when we come to the discussion time, please use the hand function or wave your hands, and I will bring you in as I'm able. So just very quickly, we've got 6 contributors to this session. So we're going to have quite a few presentations, and I imagine they will take at least an hour. So we're going to start with Professor James Renwick from Victoria University, and also the Climate Change Commission. And James will be talking more generally about the subject of reducing transport emissions. He'll be followed by Thomas Nash, who's a member of the Wellington Regional Council and chair of its Climate Committee. And Thomas will talk about rebuilding the rail network. He'll be followed with a response by Ben Ormsby, who's from the Ministry of Transport and who's been part of the Ministry's Future of Rail project. Fourth will be Paul Callister. Paul is an economist and a senior associate of the Institute for Governance and Policy Studies. And I should have mentioned this event is being sponsored by the Institute, for which I'm very thankful. And Paul will be talking about upgrading our long distance coach network. The penultimate speaker is Robert McLaughlin from Massey University. Robert is a distinguished professor of applied mathematics at Massey, and he'll be talking about the future of aviation. And finally, but not least, Heidi O'Callaghan, who is beaming in from Auckland, will be speaking on the subject of why do we need a national public transport network, and she'll be trying to draw some of the threads together from the previous discussions. Heidi is an analyst and author at Greater Auckland and a civil engineer by training. So without any more ado, James, I'll turn to you, and if you'd like to screen share, and we'll get underway. And I will endeavour to keep people to their time. All right, all the best.
Okay, thank you very much, Jonathan. Kia ora tātou. Let's get going. I'll just share the right bit of my screen here. Here we go. Yeah. All right. So hopefully everybody can see my title slide. Shot.
Yes. From, yes, it's fine.
Recent. Yeah. Okay. So this everyone. Well, maybe everyone recognises this picture from Wakakatahi NZTA taken near Plymouth a couple of weekends ago. Flooding event. I thought it nicely captured the impact of climate change and a little bit of transport as well. So I'm not sure if I'm going to say anything that you haven't heard before. We'll find out, I guess, but just very much a general overview of where we're at with carbon dioxide, climate change, transport emissions. So just to start off, here's the problem. We've got this massive spike in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. This is the one of my favourite graphics, the last 13,000 years of carbon dioxide, atmospheric carbon dioxide, with the massive increase since the Industrial Revolution. And the human timescale, which has really brought this about, is much, much shorter than the climate system timescale that ultimately will remove it again, given time. And that those timescales, there are various timescales. There are short timescales to do with exchange with the ocean and the biosphere, and then there are much longer timescales to do with really geological processes. So there's a nice paper written 10 years or so ago by Susan Solomon and others looking at the future of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere with a pause or a stop in emissions at given levels of atmospheric CO2 indicated by the numbers on the sides of the graphic. So we're not quite at 450 parts per million, but we're getting pretty close. Obviously, the higher you go, the longer the stuff stays in the air and the more of it stays in the air. So this graphic goes out to 3,000, so it's the next 1,000 years, and it demonstrates that the dashed line at the bottom is the pre-industrial level, and even if we stop emissions today, essentially, we won't be back to pre-industrial carbon dioxide for, well, actually thousands of years into the future, unless we can develop negative emissions technology, which is still a bit of a pipe dream. So CO2 is the big issue because it has this very long lifetime. And New Zealand actually puts out a lot of this stuff. Jonathan mentioned, here's our emissions profile from the last national inventory put out by MFE earlier this year. 44% of our emissions are carbon dioxide. Methane and agriculture get all the press for various reasons, but really one of the big issues for New Zealand, like every country, is carbon dioxide emissions. And it's an area where we can make some rapid progress, I think, more easily than we can with ruminant animals. So just breaking that down a little bit from the last national inventory from MFE, here's emissions by gas. The darker lines, darker bars are 1990 emissions, and the lighter blue bars are 2018 emissions. And you may or may not be able to read the numbers on the vertical scale. They're in kilotons of CO2 equivalent. And just to make the point that carbon dioxide is the first set of bars there, there's been a big increase in CO2 emissions in the last 30 years. Well, yeah, 30 years, 28 years. More so than for other gases that are considered under the UNFCCC. And when you look more closely, what do you know? You find that the biggest increase comes from transport in terms of fuel combustion, which is where most of the carbon dioxide emissions in New Zealand come from. So manufacturing and so on haven't really changed all that much. In fact, the energy industry has gone down. But transport emissions, which is mostly light vehicles, i.e. the likes of us driving to and from the shops and so on, have been responsible for the biggest increase in CO2 emissions in the country. And this is over the last 30 years, but it would apply further back in time, I'm sure. So that's the sort of scene. I guess that's why we're talking about this today, because it's a big issue for New Zealand, and it is an issue that we can make some progress on. So what are the actions that we need to take? And I think this is fairly obvious. Electrifying the vehicle fleet is a great idea, and it's easy to say something like that. It takes time to do. We can't just wave a magic wand and electrify everything overnight, but we can certainly move in the right direction more quickly. And the government's announcement of a climate emergency recently, and the idea that the public sector, the public service, would be carbon neutral by 2025, great step, and that would involve electrifying, or largely electrifying, the public service vehicle fleet, which would really push the market in New Zealand. But government can bring in things like essentially incentives for people to buy EVs. It's not going to work for everybody, but it could work for a lot more people than have them at the moment. At the same time, stopping importing internal combustion engine vehicles and setting emission standards for the ones we have. You know, we have one of the older fleets in the world, and we're one of the few countries that don't have emission standards for transport, which seems rather strange. And at the same time as we're importing all these electric vehicles, we do need to improve charging infrastructure. And it's there, and my local supermarket has a couple of charging points in the car park. That's great. But if you, and most of the charging happens at people's homes anyway, but if you're traveling around, if we really are going to electrify the fleet, I think we need a better infrastructure across the country so that it's not not a risk or not a coin toss as to when you're going to get to Napier or wherever. If you're driving a long distance, there might only be 1 or 2 places you can charge your vehicle along the way. And we'll hear a lot more about this, but other obvious action is to boost public transport, make sure that's renewably powered. I got off one of those vehicles at the top there only an hour or so ago. And the public transport network in Wellington is pretty good. It could be better, it could be more reliable, it could be more accessible, it could be more affordable. And I think investment in public transport really does pay dividends in terms of sort of civic engagement as much as reducing greenhouse gas emissions and integrating public transport with active transport. So making sure, yes, I can take my bicycle on the train if I really want to, but it's not entirely easy at the moment with the way the Wellington trains are set up. And you can take a bicycle on the bus or clip it on the front of the bus in Wellington these days, which is great. But we could go further with that kind of thinking around helping those who are cycling, improving, cycling networks, all the rest of it. I think we could make great strides there, and that would be helpful for public health in a number of ways, as well as, again, reducing emissions. And hopefully not treading on anyone's toes here saying these things, but just an entree, I guess. Road transport and freight transport, increasing the use of rail generally, especially for freight, but also for passenger services, a good idea. Ideally, again, renewably powered, so electrifying all of the main trunk line and other lines would be a very good idea. Possibly more use of coastal shipping. I'm no guru on this kind of thing, but that would be a saving in overall emissions as opposed to road freight, and possibly there are some renewable options on that front as well. And there's been a lot of talk, and I've heard a lot lately about the hydrogen economy, and hydrogen being the ticket for heavy vehicles, trucks and road freight. Others might know more than I do. I'm not seeing it as a magic bullet or something that's going to be huge in future. I'd like to hear more about this, but it is on the table as a possible option, and there are some hydrogen powered vehicles coming on stream already. This is an image of a Hyundai truck, and not just heavy trucks, but also private vehicles. There are some around, and we'll see how that develops. So that was pretty much all I had to say. I just wanted to finish off the last slide just to remind everybody, or think about what it is we need to do. I think Jonathan mentioned this at the beginning again. We need to be looking at, if we're stopping global warming at around 1.5 degrees, then we need to get to 50% reduction in emissions, especially of carbon dioxide in the next decade, and get to about 0 by 2050. And there was a paper published by Johan Rockström and co from the Stockholm Centre in Science a few years ago, looking at this, and they proposed this kind of carbon law that we've got to halve emissions every decade, essentially. And I was looking at this morning and reminding myself of just the section headings I liked a lot. They tell the story. So you have a look at this paper, talks about this decade, 2020 to 2030 being the decade of Herculean efforts, and I totally endorse that. We do need to pull out all the stops, and a lot of the stuff we're talking about with transport emissions, I think, Doesn't have to be that Herculean. It might be expensive in some ways, but not all that difficult. And then assuming we get to that halfway mark in 2030, we have technology and innovation has really been inspired, and we have many breakthroughs, at least hopefully, in the following decade. And then by the 2040s, we've locked in most of the change we need, and we're just sort of helping to reinforce the change. So I like that thinking, but the upfront decade that we are in now, and we'll be in 2021 in a matter of days, it is the Herculean one, and we do need to make as much progress as we can, as fast as we can. And that's my lot.
Well, thank you very much, James. That was an excellent introduction.
Nice.
We now turn to Thomas Nash. So Thomas, if you have some slides, if you could screen share and begin your presentation on rebuilding the rail network. And while you're getting ready, I note that there's quite a few messages on the chats box, so that's good, and some interesting points being raised. And I'm sure they will be discussed during the second part of this Zoom, if not by some of the speakers in the next 40, 50 minutes. So Thomas, greetings, welcome. And how are you going?
Good, thanks. Yeah, morning everyone. Just trying to see how I can get all this done.
Just go to screen share at the bottom.
Yeah.
Yep, terrific. Okay.
It's one anyway. I mean, it's not exactly the one I was hoping to use, but I'll see what I can do. Okay, well, kia ora koutou, kia ora Jonathan, and kia ora Paul. Thanks for organising, and yeah, tēnā rā koutou katoa. So, yeah, I guess I come at this whole topic as a councillor, regional councillor for Greater Wellington, and the chair of our climate committee, as you mentioned, Jonathan. And I also come at it as someone who has lived and worked in other countries, and particularly in Europe, where rail travel is sort of a completely normal, expected way of getting around, and really a preferred way of getting around. Convenient. It's part of the sort of culture. And so yeah, I guess I'm hopeful that we'll be able to get to this point. In fact, I'm convinced that we will be able to get to a point where rail travel is a much more embedded part of our everyday lives in New Zealand. So the first thing to say was, I think I'll just leave this thing up there because I can't find the way to get my other slides up. But I wanted to put some slides up that would show that the first thing that I wanted to say, which is an encouraging thing, is that whenever I do a tweet, so I dabble in Twitter, and whenever I do a tweet with an image of a train or something about railways, it is invariably the most the most widely viewed tweets I've ever done. So I did a tweet of the Hapua Whenua viaduct around Ohakune with the Northern Explorer going over it, and it got like 40,000 views, which is about 40,000 views more than my average tweet would get. So there is a I guess I'm saying that at the outset to say there's a deeply held connection towards railways still in this country, so that's encouraging. And the other thing I was going to say was just over the last few months, we've had quite an interesting experience, a positive experience with fellow councils, district councils, and regional councils along the North Island main trunk line route, where the Northern Explorer, Kiwi Rail stopped the Northern Explorer during the lockdown, the COVID quarantine period, and they didn't restart it afterwards, and we kind of suspected that maybe they didn't really intend to restart it because they didn't think it was worth it. So we sort of mobilised, and we got I think there were 16 councils that wrote a letter to Kiwi Rail, and we mobilised a bit, and that was quite successful. We got the thing restarted. Maybe they were going to restart it anyway, but as a result of that collaboration between councils along the North Island main trunk line, there is now a conversation happening between that collective of councils and Kiwi Rail about whether we could get some additional services that would run in a business case. Or, well, there's work towards a business case for a Northern Connector as opposed to a Northern Explorer. And this Northern Connector would pick up some of the other railway stations that have been missed out by the Northern Explorer in that kind of central North Island area. So that's quite good. So that's encouraging. And of course, the railways were a major part of the transport system that underpinned our economy and our society in this country for many decades. So there's a big opportunity, I think, to rebuild the rail network. As I said, I guess I think, not to be too deterministic about this, but I do feel that it's inevitable, really, that our regional and intercity rail system scales up massively in this country. It's just really a question of when we decide to start investing in it properly. And yeah, I was just going to refer to the Green Party proposal during the election of they proposed a $9 billion regional rail plan over 10 years. And it sounds like a lot of money, but to put it in context, after the global financial crisis, the government spent about $12 billion on a relatively small set of motorways. So you'd get a lot more bang for your buck with a rail plan. So I guess but there's a lot of work to do, obviously. And I'm just going to run through a few points and then stop. But I was thinking a little bit about the infrastructure, think a little bit about figuring out who does what, and then maybe talk a bit about the sort of cultural shift that will be required, and then maybe a few points on what we might want to focus on next. Right.
Just to say, Thomas, if you can be very brief about each point, please. Otherwise, we'll be here all day.
I've been rabbiting on too long. Okay, right, infrastructure. First, the tracks, we'll need to do a lot of double tracking in certain areas, straightening of the tracks, and obviously maintenance. Question there is where to focus, and I would suggest massively increasing our capacity in the metro areas. Second, trains, we've got to buy a substantial number of new trains. We could look at tilt trains, which would be able to run at a maximum speed of 160 kph. We should probably also be looking at battery electric, dual multiple units, and I would suggest we want national procurement of these to get the best value. A question about electrification of the lines. In some areas, this may not be worth it. It might be better to go battery electric. For example, the Wellington to Wairarapa line might be better value to get battery electric trains rather than electrify that. And yeah, just a point about construction and expertise and planning. Be a good idea to see what we can do to keep the contractors that are in this country for things like City Rail Link here so that they can work on upgrading our rail system. Who does what? So this is quite political, I guess, but right now Kiwi Rail is in charge of the tracks, they're in charge of the freight, and they're in charge of the intercity services that we have, which are tourism services. Commuter rail is done by councils and council-controlled organisations. There's a question there about whether some other reconfiguration of entities and responsibilities, maybe a new entity for passenger rail, who knows? And what about commercial operators like Transdev, which runs the trains in Wellington and Auckland? What about them maybe running a sleeper train? They've suggested that. Culture, yeah, I guess there's a cultural shift from sort of the individualism that we have with the convenience and freedom of driving in our cars to point, and then the kind of collectivism of being in a public transport environment with other people, which is normal in other countries and to an extent in Wellington and Auckland, but not so much in the rest of the country. Yeah, I guess thinking about the experience on board, how enjoyable it can be to be on a train, and I guess slowing down a bit, the ability to work from home now, which is more accepted, that should help to make long train journeys more attractive. And then I was just going to mention Anthony Tonnell, the musician and artist who has done the Railland performances. I think this is a helpful way to start to embed this cultural shift around the country. Three very, very brief final points. One, in terms of what we do next, I think it would be useful if we could get a pledge from organisations and businesses saying that if a sleeper train were to be introduced, for example, that those organisations would pledge to purchase tickets on that for their employees. And as you mentioned, as someone mentioned, with the net zero public service by 2025 commitment, you could imagine that there would be a lot of organisations that might want to do that. Yeah, I guess we do need a bit more facts, figures, images, maps, artists' impressions to start to give an idea of what this rail system would look like and why people would like to be on it. And then we're going to need to go to the hard edge of the actual business cases, which is quite expensive to do. It needs a lot of expertise. But yeah, that's what I was going to say. I'll leave you with that.
Well, thank you very much, Thomas, and sorry to give you a hurry up. I'm just conscious that we've got quite a few presenters. Now, Ben, I think you were going to respond and perhaps make some specific comments of your own. So if you're able to screen share
Yes.
with your presentation, that would be great. And while you're just getting organized, just to say thank you for the excellent chat comments that are coming in and the responses. Lots of important points being made. Ben, over to you.
I don't have any slides to share. I thought I was
okay.
just gonna, I guess, just sort of respond or add to what Thomas has said. So
that's fine. Go ahead.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. All right, so yeah, I'm Ben Ormsby. I'm part of the placemaking and urban development team at the Ministry of Transport, and so my team's role, I guess, is about how we integrate transport with urban development within cities and between cities and regions. And I guess just thinking about what the Ministry of Transport role is, it's at that system setting level. So I think some of the things that maybe Thomas referenced around who does what, that's the sort of thing that the ministry is thinking about in terms of rail and passenger rail. And I think one of the key things that sort of guides our work is the Transport Outcomes Framework. And I don't know if people are familiar with that or not, but it sort of covers the range of outcomes, transport outcomes in terms of access, health and safety of people, environmental sustainability and resilience, which really sort of underpins how we design the system. And so I'll just put in a plug for our newly refreshed website, transport.govt.nz, which has a lot of information that I'm going to talk about today, and it's reasonably easy to search, and you can filter by mode as well if you're interested. So Future of Rail started about 3 years ago, and this was came through the government that came in 2017, and they were thinking about more sustainable long-term funding and a planning model, I guess, for rail and for the role of rail in the transport system. And so this was looking at things such as investing in rail, I guess, to turn things around from the managed decline that had been happening over a number of decades, I guess, since the privatization, and then the public purchase of rail back into the government. And thinking about, I guess, more from a freight perspective, so growing Kiwi Rail's network and looking at a mode shift from road to rail. Things such as supporting connectivity between the regions and economic development, as well as growing the urban commuter rail and regional rail. And giving more priority through the government policy statement for land transport. So starting to look at whether funding could come through the National Land Transport Fund rather than just relying on Crown grants. And so with this review, some of the recommendations were aimed at sort of integrating the Land Transport Management Act to enable better investment decisions, I guess, across road and rail investments, and providing Kiwi Rail with longer term funding and greater certainty, and then also better transparency for government expenditure on rail. So this is through like the projects and spending that come through the National Land Transport Fund. So the Rail Act was passed, and that was one of the key outcomes from the review, and that was looking at integrating the rail network planning and funding into the National Land Transport System. So to go with that, a long-term plan was needed to guide the government investment and also supporting private sector decision making. And this guidance, I guess, sits alongside the government policy statement and informs the investment that happens. And what this means is through the GPS, we can focus on more of the non-commercial benefits of rail. So currently it's KiwiRail's mandate is around running a business. And I guess what we see from passenger rail is that there are other benefits, other social benefits, other access benefits that people are looking for from rail. And so I guess sort of turning to the infrastructure side of things and what Thomas mentioned, there is at the moment the investments focused on sort of bringing things up to scratch. And so you'll see for the likes of Auckland City Rail Link, which I guess is a new piece of infrastructure, but really is about unlocking the benefits of the whole system. The third main line, extending the electrification to Pukekohe and the new stations at Drury. So a lot of this is about not so much expanding the network, but making the network work better. So providing enhanced services and better infrastructure to make the most of the passenger rail network. And similar things happening in Wellington as well, with the renewals and maintenance work happening on the Wellington network, double tracking Trentham to Upper Hutt, and improvements to the Wider Upper Line. And then also, I guess, as Thomas mentioned, the Northern Explorer, those other KiwiRail kind of tourist services, improving the infrastructure to support them, and then, you know, whether there's potential expansion in the future. I guess some of the key things that have also come out recently, if we're thinking about passenger rail and building up a passenger rail network, is Te Huia, which is the new Hamilton to Auckland service. And so, you know, this was a key thing that was going to be introduced, I guess. It had been tried before, and but the sort of need was expressed again to try and have this service start. And although there's been some delays with the opening due to the issues on the Auckland network, I guess, with the rolling contact fatigue and the maintenance issues, that is sort of tentatively scheduled for February, and that's really an expansion of the regional network to start thinking about connections between cities that didn't exist before, or haven't existed for a while, I should say. And the other one, another key one, I guess, is the capital connection. So between Palmerston North and Wellington, getting refurbished through the New Zealand Upgrade Program. So even though it was quite a roads heavy sort of package of investment, some of it is going towards enhancing those regional rail services. And I guess looking to the future, one of the key projects that I've been involved in is the Hamilton to Auckland Rapid Rail. And so this is really looking at providing a service, an interregional service that goes beyond that tourist, you know, tourist design, tourist level of train service. And so a sort of an indicative business case has been prepared over the last year or so, which is available on the Transport website. And this is really looking at that 160 kilometre an hour, potentially up to 250 kilometre an hour commuter or fast service to connect Hamilton and Auckland, and also looking at, is there an offline solution or a new rail corridor between those two cities. So this is really starting to get into that sort of advanced rail planning and thinking about building a network for, you know, the next 100 years and being fit for purpose, I guess, for those reducing carbon emissions and integrating land use and transport. So particularly in the Auckland, Hamilton, Tauranga triangle, really thinking about where growth's happening, where the demand for housing and businesses are, and then connecting those, providing people with alternatives rather than just driving or relying on the motorways.
Ben, just one more minute, please.
Yeah, I guess that's kind of all I had to really comment on. I guess in terms of the wrapping it all together, the review of the future of rail and the rail plan, which is still draft but will be released next year, is really starting to drive the system towards providing these sorts of solutions and thinking about things from an interregional perspective, which hasn't been really possible before.
All right, Ben, thank you very much for those comments, and we look forward to seeing the plan when it comes out. I hope there will be some degree of urgency in this process, because as Jim has highlighted, we have very little time from a planetary point of view. But thank you. Now, Paul, over to you on the topic of upgrading our long distance coach network.
Well, good morning. It's been an interesting discussion so far, but I'm talking about something that actually still works at the moment. I'm of a generation that used the integrated bus and train services provided by New Zealand Railways, and just looking at the videos of people on today, I think many of you probably use them. But in recent years, I've been undertaking research on long distance coaches, and as part of that, I've been using them quite substantially, including trips between Paikakariki and Auckland. And it's both a good and a bad story. The good story is that we already have a long distance coach network. Intercity run about 130 services per day. We don't have data on the numbers travelling, but it's likely to be in the thousands on a good day if you think 40 people might be on each coach. And these coaches link every small town and every large city in New Zealand. So they're already there. We also don't know who actually uses these coaches, but I suspect from my own travels, it's mainly young people and older people, and they seem to be overrepresented from the poorer communities. So when you go through places like Manukau, Pororua, Tokoroa, you see more of those sort of people getting on and off. So we don't have an ethnic breakdown, but I suspect Maori and Pacific people and new immigrants are overrepresented in the users. Pre-COVID, we also had a number of tourist services aimed at young people. First of all, there was Naked Bus, which then got taken over by Mana, and then Skip, which is run by Intercity, but Skip's not running at the moment. Long distance coaches are already a low emission form of travel. And if you look at the various carbon calculators, you find that if you compare driving in an ordinary ICE car or flying, the coach trip is about 80% less carbon dioxide emissions. So the technology's already there. And what we're also seeing is that the technology will get better. They're already experimenting with electric buses overseas and hydrogen buses. I know there's a big argument about hydrogen, but certainly the electric buses are being trialled in North America and Europe. So we're going to see even lower emissions coming on fairly soon. And then they're not the fantasy that often we talk about with electric planes and hydrogen powered planes, which may be there, but not in the time frame that we really need. We also know that, as both Thomas and Ben have talked about, that there's a lot of planning going on about trains, but it's going to be a long-term effort to actually get trains back in to the situation we were in the past. So we need the buses to complement the train network. If you look at, say, New South Wales, they have an integrated network. If you go out to somewhere like Broken Hill, you go on the train to Dubbo, and then you catch a bus. And every stop along the way, there's a bus waiting to take people out to the rural areas. But even with a good train service, we're going to have buses or coaches to service the low density spurs, to link the stations on the fast lines, because we don't want the train stopping too often. And there's big areas of New Zealand where rail is unlikely to be built in any time future. One of my big issues of travelling on the buses is that the off-coach infrastructure in many towns and cities is extremely poor. And this includes the downtown bus depot, the most used bus depot probably in New Zealand, at Sky City in Auckland. For example, in the photo is of the men's toilets. The toilets are frightening to go into. You think you might get mugged. They have, they're hopeless for parents. They don't have showers, they don't have drinking waters and such like. And Taupo is also the same. There are some good examples in New Zealand. Hamilton is an excellent example. Franz Joseph is an excellent example, and that came about through funding from the Provincial Growth Fund. But one of the problems why we also need the good off-bus infrastructure is that most of our coaches don't have toilets on buses. And we're really unusual in that. You can look at just about any country in the world, Norway, Britain, Australia, the United States, even the Greyhound buses, they all have onboard toilets. And it's just an oddity that we don't. Strangely enough, Intercity has just announced a service yesterday that's going to go from Palmerston North to Wellington. It's targeting at the flying market of taking people down to Wellington Airport, and they are going to have an on-bus toilet. So they realise that flyers want on-bus toilets, so they need to do it for the others. The other issue that I find really shocking is that facilities for disabled people are really poor. You can see on the screen there's an example of a bus in Australia where you can put wheelchairs onto buses. In all the Greyhound buses in America, you can do that. But we also have the odd situation in New Zealand that bus drivers are not allowed to help people on and off buses. And if anybody travels on buses, often you'll find that the steps are really steep, especially the double deckers. And I've been on buses where the bus driver says, I can't help you on, and passengers have had to get off to help an elderly person. Now in North America, again on Greyhound buses, the bus drivers are allowed to help disabled people on and off. Also on the slide is a picture of the toilets and the bus stop in Taupo. Now this is an important interchange for buses, and it's an important comfort stop for buses. You can see in the very distance in the photo is a double-decker bus, and you can see the award-winning toilets with their lovely painting on the side. But it's a 150-metre walk, 300-metre walk to go from the bus to the toilets. And so, you know, often it's raining, it can be snowing in Taupo. And when you get there, they're very tired toilets. There's no communal things for families, no changing tables, no drinking water. It's a really poor situation. The other issue where we really fall behind Europe is that we can't take bikes on most buses. Occasionally you can if you book ahead and you get the right bus and you get the right bus driver, they'll allow you to do it. But in Europe, the Flix buses, most of them can carry bikes. And it's not just for getting around to the great biking tracks that we've got around New Zealand, but people often want to take their bikes as the final mile. So to get to the bus stop and to get off the bus stop. So it's a really simple thing to do, but we don't do it as yet in New Zealand. There's also the issue of who does pay for the off-bus infrastructure. And I've just submitted to the Taupo Council's sustainable transport plan. Whoops, just gone backwards, sorry. And basically Taupo says that they're not going to provide a good infrastructure for the buses because the bus passengers and the bus companies are not going to pay for it. Now, they've just got a grant from the Provincial Growth Fund, which has just finished, of course, and from their ratepayers to upgrade their airports. So they're quite happy to use taxpayer and ratepayer money to upgrade airports, but they're not willing to do it for for their bus travellers. So how do we bring about improvements? Theoretically, competition would work, but we've seen companies come and go. Naked Bus went, bought by Mana, now Mana Bus closed. Mana Bus did bring in toilets. Intercity is the dominant force in New Zealand, so competition is probably not going to work. There could be regulation, there could be subsidies, there could be renationalisation. In terms of regulation, I think that's the first thing that we need to do. For example, in Australia, the regulations are that you cannot operate a long distance coach without onboard toilets. And I think that would be something that we could really do in New Zealand. I've written to a range of politicians about this, suggesting that should be brought into government policy. As yet, I haven't actually received any replies to those letters, so it's a bit of a problem campaigning. So I'll leave it there, but I'm sure Heidi can fill in some other details about the network aspects of buses.
Paul, thank you very much. That was really excellent. And these simple but very practical and important issues that you've raised, like toilets, really do resonate. I have a relative who finds it difficult to travel long distance by bus because she has a weak bladder, and as you say, there aren't toilets. So these things matter, and thank you. That was excellent. Robert, we're in your hands now, and we're turning, I think, from land to air, the future of aviation. So please, if you'd like to share your screen and move on, that would be great.
Let's see how we go here. Can you see my screen?
Yes, that's excellent, Rob.
Okay, very good. Thanks, everybody. And thank you, Paul Callister, for taking the initiative to organize this. Paul and I have been looking at this issue of aviation emissions for some time, and some of our past work on this is collected on this website, Planetary Ecology, if you're interested in taking that further. Here's a map of airports in New Zealand. This is actually well out of date. This is from 2006. It's from the heyday of aviation in some sense in New Zealand, because in those days there were international flights also from Dunedin, Palmerston North and Hamilton. Live in Palmerston North. In 2006, you could fly to 5 different international destinations directly from Palmerston North. It was kind of ridiculous. So we have a lot of airports. Air New Zealand is still serving 20 of them. It's a very large market, 20 million domestic passengers a year. I don't know how many bus passengers there are, but I would think not that many. And of course, if you're lucky, if you're on a major route and you're booking ahead, you can get very, very cheap tickets indeed. That's the backdrop, but of course that's not low emission. In terms of regional public transport, 50% of the country live in Auckland, Wellington and Christchurch, and that was still more or less the case 40 years ago in 1980. So there may have been a rural decline, but there hasn't really been a regional decline, because a lot of the regional cities have also been growing rapidly in that period. So you could either say half of us live in Auckland, Wellington and Christchurch and half don't. You could say that half of us live in Auckland, Waikato and Bay of Plenty. That's also 50% of the population in that little circle there. Or you could say that 60% of the population live on the main trunk line between Auckland and Wellington. So even though it's a sparsely populated country, and on average, there's certainly regions where regional transport is reasonably high density. Before I go on to the aviation, I just put in a plea for this little region here. I live in Palmerston North, and this corridor from Palmerston North to Wellington is likely to undergo significant growth. And as far as I know, no one is looking at that as a single region. It doesn't really make sense to have 150 strip development along a 150 kilometre stretch with the kind of populations we're talking about, but that's exactly what is about to happen. So what's the problem with the current setting? Well, there's 1 million tonnes a year of CO2. And nobody is looking at that. There is no plan to cut emissions from domestic aviation. And as we heard from James earlier, all of that has to stop. So at the moment, it's not even on the radar. And all the discussion of various issues related to aviation, you can go back through a paper trail going back for decades, essentially. None of that is looking at emissions. It doesn't have to be that way. The UK, of course, has a very well-developed rail and bus network, and they have just 1/7 the per capita domestic aviation emissions. And it's been going down in recent years as basically fewer flights are available. What's also wrong with that, the current system is it's not really sustainable even financially. A lot of the passengers were international tourists. We don't know what's going to happen there. A lot of them were business travel, people doing day trips for work. That may not continue to quite the same degree in the future. And of course, if there is less air travel in the future, that would tend to raise costs. As Paul mentioned, the regional airports, they're pretty marginal financially, and this is the main issue that's been discussed in the media over the past decade, is they're basically desperate for more subsidies. They were rebuffed for quite a while, but then they had more luck with the Provincial Growth Fund, and then more luck with the Shovel Ready Fund. Most alarming one here is Masterton Airport got $10 million from the Shovel Ready Fund to expand their airport. They don't have commercial air service from Masterton Airport. And the council never discussed this application to the Shovel Ready Fund. No one knows actually what they're planning to do with that airport. There's a complex mixture of ownership, and this gives the councils generally have an incentive to try and promote growth from their local airport. So on the 11th of March, just before we locked down, Hamilton City Council wrote to Hamilton Airport asking them to aggressively pursue restarting international flights. So there has been some shrinkage of the network. I'm in Palmy, so Palmy to Nelson and Palmy to Hamilton have been cancelled, and then Origin came and picked them up. But it's not really the same service. It's $400 return, and there's much fewer seats available. It's really aiming at a different market to what used to exist. And these little short flights, they have just closed recently, and I'd be very surprised if they come back under the present way things work. There's also a local debate about the Kapiti Airport, which is scheduled for closure, and some of the locals, including the council, are opposed to it. Another way in which the regional airports get a subsidy is through the Airways Corporation, who are state-owned, and they provide the air traffic control services, and they are withdrawing from 6 of the smaller commercial airports. I mean, they operate commercial flights, but they're non-commercial in the sense that they're subsidized by Airways Corporation. And this has the fact that the air and the train and the bus system isn't integrated. That is a problem, and that encourages people to drive to the airport and park rather than using public transport to get to the airport. Paul mentioned there is now a very fancy bus connecting to the Palmerston North Airport and to the Wellington Airport. So the main thing that has to happen here is just to get aviation emissions onto the radar so that somebody is looking at it and dealing with it. There's an interesting legal question here, which I'm not a lawyer, but I'm throwing this out there. Currently, airports don't have to account for their scope 3 emissions, which would be the emissions from the aircraft using their facility. So what happens when you apply for a resource consent to build a new airport, like the proposed airport in Terrace in central Otago? They claim that the emissions of the aircraft that would use the airport are not part of their responsibility, but under the RMA, which itself is going to be replaced, you do have to account for all the cumulative downstream effects of the new activity that you're doing. So it's a question in my mind whether that would in fact include the emissions of the flights. What are the other alternatives? Well, here's a little electric plane. Of course, that looks rather nice. A little 2-seater electric plane flying over the Swiss Alps. It's actually uses less energy than a Nissan Leaf to, of course, go much faster. It looks pretty nice. And there is now a 2-seater electric plane in Nelson that they're going to offer scenic flights on. I'd be very surprised if there was any significant electric aviation in New Zealand in the next 10 years. Looking out further, it is a possibility. It is technically possible to fly a medium-sized electric plane from Auckland to Wellington, but that's so far off the radar in terms of what people are considering now that it's almost can't really take it into consideration. And you've just seen all the difficulties that we're having decarbonising land transport, which is much easier. This is far-fetched, so I would put this in the camp of sort of techno-utopianism, people just basically clutching at straws, or not, that's putting it a bit harsh, but people looking to things that might possibly happen in the future rather than planning for actual steps that will make a lower emission future come about. The other possibility that Paul and I have been interested in is you can, in fact, reduce emissions from aviation by producing fully synthetic aviation fuel, which is basically kerosene. And here we see, it's just this little bit here. This is a plant in Norway. That's just a computer graphic. The plant doesn't exist yet, but it's under construction. And they will make synthetic kerosene out of water by electrolysis of water. And the carbon comes out, sucking CO2 out of the air. So this would actually be technically climate neutral. It's quite a large plant. It's 500 megawatts of electricity going in. It's expensive to build. And if you built something like that in New Zealand, you could eliminate 3/4 of the CO2 emissions from domestic aviation. So it's a technical solution, which is just starting to come about. You just need eye-wateringly large amounts of renewable electricity to make this happen.
Robert, just 1 more minute, please,
Yep.
if that's all right.
Yeah. So although this is a technical solution, you would need a major change in the entire energy situation in New Zealand for anything like this to happen. So what should we do? It's obviously aviation emissions is a difficult sector. Well, we should stop subsidizing it, and we should try and integrate the overall planning of aviation together with bus and rail and other systems. We should connect the networks up together so that the regional bus and train systems connect to the airports. Looking out longer term, the main trunk line passes very close to the Palmerston North and to the Hamilton airports. It's literally just 200 or 300 meters away. That would be something to look at for the future. Of course, there is the Fly Less movement. As there is greater awareness of climate change, the Fly Less movement has grown. Deirdre Kent and Paul Callister started a Facebook group, Fly Less Kiwis. It's been popular. However, this is very difficult for some people. When you're faced with, when you want to see your elderly relative in Auckland and you live in Wellington and you've got a $29 fare on the table, it's going to be pretty tempting. I guess all we can do at this point is just continue to work to try to get lower aviation emissions onto the radar so that it becomes part of our planning. Thank you.
Robert, thank you very much. A really important topic area, as you indicate, frequently totally ignored by policymakers and the public, but critical. Just to say personally, just while Heidi's getting organised, we have deliberately bought a long-range EV, or an EV with a long range, so that we can travel by land rather than fly, since all our relatives are scattered across the country, typically at least 300 or 400 kilometres from Wellington. Heidi, thank you. Over to you. You might need to unmute if you are muted, Heidi. Heidi, are you there? Heidi, you're muted. You just need to unmute, Heidi.
Finally, sorry. Right, I'll start the share again.
Right.
Except I've lost it, just a mo.
Well, just while you're finding that, Heidi, just to say, I think we've had some fantastic points made by the previous speakers, and it's been great to see the chat discussion going on. Those who've been presenting, you might just like to have a look at the chat sections that you may have missed while you were making your presentations. And Heidi, you need to go to the audience view rather than presenter's view. That's it. Right. Off you go.
It's not right for me yet, sorry.
Oh.
Is that still okay with you? Or has that changed?
That's changed. No, it was better before. Can you just talk to what's on our screen? No.
You've got to start your meeting, your thing properly. Go back to this. Escape.
I don't.
Now, no.
So just while Heidi's getting organised, as soon as Heidi's finished, we'll have the opportunity for discussion, and I'll really be just led by what people want to discuss. There's obviously a wide range of issues, and some of them are very much at the policy end of the spectrum, both about sort of regulatory matters, subsidisation matters, and so on. Some of them are more technical. Some of them relate to the whole sort of system design and how we ensure we have integrated approaches to this challenge of reducing emissions. There's obviously, lots and lots of very specific matters, from the question of, toilets on buses through to ensuring that we properly integrate bus, rail and air arrangements. How are you going, Heidi?
Does that work yet?
It looks fine at the moment. You just...
Great. Sorry about that, everybody. And I have a lot to say too, so I'll be talking pretty quickly.
Talk fast.
I will. If we apply some Kiwi compassion and are willing to challenge a few standard practices, we have the potential to create a transport system that enables New Zealanders to flourish. Let's aim not just for lower emissions, but for nicer lifestyles, more opportunities, thriving businesses, and a healthy environment. We've heard today about planes and trains and coaches. Trains and coaches are two elements, I think, in a low emissions national public transport network. They complement and maximise ridership for each other in a network built around passengers' needs. Ideally, long journeys can be taken mainly by train because they're smoother and more comfortable, with the ability to get up and walk around, and they should be fast. But coaches provide coverage, extending the network to more places. And in terms of long-term planning, the flexibility of coaches is useful. Coach routes can be changed once new rail lines are added. I'm going to talk about the other elements and why there should be public funding for establishing and maintaining this network, even if the services themselves are privately run. First up, bus stops, depots and stations are network elements. This is the Ruakaka bus stop. A good example of why we need regulation to allow the network to function. There are vans, shuttles and taxis that fill the gaps where timetabled services don't exist, or where the services are hopeless for people with disabilities or health issues. Many are driven by volunteers. A full network should ease that burden on these volunteers, but the network will probably still need smaller vehicles in the most remote areas. Some of these services simply highlight the lack of a network for other users who don't qualify for the service. And a critical part of the network, often overlooked, is safe walking and biking infrastructure. If passengers can't get to the station safely, they can't use the service. So what else is needed? Operations need to be coordinated so that the services function together. I think there was a comment on the chat about that. And there needs to be a single combined booking, information and communication system using both digital platforms and traditional ones. And finally, we need a robust and intuitive wayfinding system in each town, in the same way that drivers are provided with signage. We'll know it's a network when it doesn't take 3 days to get from Auckland to the Hokianga, or when a delayed train doesn't mean your ongoing coach ticket is forfeited. The entire network, the vehicles, the built environment, and the systems need to be accessible for people with different needs. We need this network for people, the economy, and the environment. First, people. More than a quarter of New Zealanders don't have driving licenses. And the number of people who can't drive is going to increase. Firstly, because our population is aging. As you can see, elderly people will be a significant part of the population in many regions by 2033. But decision makers in Auckland and Wellington, where the populations are the youngest, are the least likely to be aware of this. Remaining fit and socially connected is important to our health as we age. The ability to walk to a bus stop and then to bus to a walkable town helps enormously with this. And we cannot continue to rely on volunteer drivers. As the ratio of older people to younger drivers increases, this volunteering will become onerous and unsustainable burden. Secondly, fewer city dwellers will be drivers. Our cities need massive mode shift, and driving will become optional for more and more people. Plenty will choose not to drive, or not to drive frequently enough to feel confident on the open road. Thirdly, organisations adopting sustainable transport policies will be looking for public transport options to reduce their staff members' flying and driving emissions. Many people travelling between towns for work prefer to arrive relaxed rather than exhausted after concentrating on driving. And of course, children don't drive. A child might simply want to go by coach to keep in contact with both her parents, who now live in different towns. But we should be providing independent mobility so kids can pursue interests too. One problem is that intercity won't take unaccompanied children if their journey involves a transfer. We can actually fix this. We can make travel safe for independent children and regulate to ensure they are not excluded. Youth in regional areas need public transport too. They often can't afford to buy or maintain a safe car, and few regional towns provide driver license testing, so getting a license can end up an enormous hassle. Young adults may want to be able to take up employment or training opportunities that come up in nearby towns, or to engage in sports games and cultural activities. Forced to rely on workmates or teammates who may be inexperienced drivers and have older, less safe cars, leads too often to a tragic loss of young life. A national public transport network will allow all these people to flourish where today's system does not. The second reason for establishing a low emissions national public transport network is the economy. Waka Kotahi research shows that when a lack of access to transport in rural areas means people cannot get to goods, services, and activities, it leads to an observable spiral of depopulation and further loss of opportunities. Rather than our regional towns being too small to justify investment in better transport choices, the lack of transport investment has been a constant dampener on local economic activity. Regeneration of our regional towns is something we should plan as part of the shift from a linear economy to a circular, sustainable economy. The different model requires different transport planning. Green, low-carbon businesses involve material reclamation loops that turn one person's waste into someone else's raw resource. Every business is different, but these often involve smaller, more frequent transport movements. Green businesses can also be more reliant on local labour and often serve customers on site. Therefore, transport planning for developing a healthy regional economy needs to prioritise trips for people and for people with small amounts of cargo. And UK research shows that rural areas in particular offer huge emissions reduction potential via e-bikes and e-cargo bikes. Their analysis has shown they can cut their transport emissions by 50% through e-bikes and e-cargo bikes, and it's mainly in the rural areas. The last thing these modes need is transport planning to suit a linear economy, prioritising large trucks barrelling along at unsafe speeds. We need to get as much freight as we can onto rail and lower the speed limits on the roads. In terms of sustainable domestic tourism, the same issues hold. We have gorgeous geography, but a lack of public transport to small towns and an inability to walk or cycle safely within and around the towns is a major repellent to holidaying there. Relaxing without having to drive is a good reason why people who can afford it fly overseas to walkable places for holidays. This is a Swiss carriage, half of which is equipped to take bikes or skis. We can do this too, and rental or share bike schemes can also meet the needs of tourists. A common theme here is the need for safe walking and biking infrastructure. It's needed as part of the network, and it's needed for everyone, locals, visitors, children, the elderly, and businesses. No one should have to walk or cycle on a road like this, whether they're on holiday and wanting to see the countryside, meeting a bus, or going to school or work. This spot is less than 4.8 kilometres from a high school, incidentally. So children living here would be considered as within walking distance by the Ministry of Education, and they wouldn't qualify for a bus service. We need programs to improve safety for children walking and biking throughout the whole country. Our safety statistics are valid reasons for anyone to want to go by bus or train and not have to drive, but they are even more valid reasons to not want to walk to the bus stop. The third reason for a low emissions national public transport network is the environment. For starters, we have enough roads. Coaches and trains don't require roading expansion and don't cause the destruction to soil, biodiversity and waterways that road building causes. Secondly, if people will switch from driving to public transport, our land transport emissions will drop. But that is just the tip of the iceberg of the environmental impacts of driving. Here's the rest of the iceberg. And if we manage to normalise domestic tourism by having reliable public transport, that also cuts our aviation emissions. Given all these benefits, an equally important question to ask is, why don't we already have such a network? To answer this, as always, you need to look at the budget. Funding is usually allocated via the GPS activity classes. We don't have an activity class for a national public transport network. We don't have an activity class for interregional coach travel. There are public transport activity classes, but they aren't intended for interregional travel. And there is a new rail network activity class, but it only covers maintenance and renewals, not upgrades. The walking and cycling activity class is still severely underfunded, a fraction of the amount recommended by the UN, who say at least 20% of our transport budgets is needed. We can only imagine the ease of movement by foot and bike we would have today had we built to make sure drivers paid for the facilities to keep people safe from motor vehicles, as is their duty. In summary, some activity classes are missing and others are not matched with funds appropriate for the job. And that's because what we have been investing in is transport emissions. I know New Zealanders care about our children's future, but somehow we've just lost our way. Why is this? I suppose if you're not somebody who sometimes travels with a goat, it wouldn't occur to you to design for someone who sometimes travels with a goat. We don't need to design for people traveling with goats, I think. But what needs to change so we do start designing for all our people? Do we really have to fight for or against each project with evidence? One of the problems we face is a lack of data, because without funding from an activity class, the data is not being collected. For example, the public transport ridership kept by Waka Kotahi doesn't include ridership on the scenic rail or the intercity coaches, let alone the many smaller operators. That makes mode-neutral analysis impossible. There's no database of regional bus stops. Waka Kotahi don't know how many bus stops there are, where they're located, who owns the land, who maintains them, or how much money is spent on their maintenance. There is no database about safety associated with long-distance public transport. We know coaches and trains are very safe modes, but we can't intelligently regulate vehicle design because we have no local database about passenger or driver injury rates, whether it's from traffic trauma, passengers falling down steps, personal safety, or from drivers hurting their backs handling luggage. How do we know whether investing in public transport can offer better value for money than making changes to the road if the safety benefits of public transport are not evaluated? It'd be nice to see a multi-criteria analysis, including important social benefits too, like how children are stunted in their development through a lack of independent mobility, how transport independence reduces youth depression and suicide, how elderly people are afraid of falling and need to be provided with walkable places in order to remain confident enough to go out. When Waka Kotahi provided advice to the Provincial Growth Fund on transport investment for regional development, given what we know about data availability, can you tell me how a mode-neutral analysis to inform that advice was possible? And when a decision is made to invest in a road, do you think they compared the benefits for investing that money instead on improving public and active transport, including all the benefits for our people, economy, and environment? People's reckons are actually the reason for the direction we've taken. So what do we do now? We have ill-conceived, sprawl-supporting roads being designed and built all around the country. We are subsidizing the most polluting form of transport of all, aviation. This is fundamentally inconsistent with our climate and wellbeing goals. We need that funding retrieved. Declaring a climate emergency is meaningless without actually changing direction. We need to become more confident in managing change. We're capable of U-turns on transport decisions and major shifts in practice. So let's discuss now what we can do. It will be worth it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Heidi. Perhaps just leave that slide there just for a minute so people can have a look. Thank you to all the presenters. You've covered a terrific range of material, some of it very focused on transport and particularly public transport, but some of it highlighting the need for an integrated approach to planning, which views transport in its wider economic, social, environmental context, and which highlights the importance of systems and interdependencies, and also some actually very simple things like toilets on buses and so on. So we've now got about 45 minutes or so for discussion. I'd ask people if you would like just to use the hand function to indicate you'd like to comment, or you can wave your hand. And we'll simply proceed as best we can through a series of issues. And I might just take the opportunity, depending on the nature of the topic, to seek views from a range of the panel members, again, depending on the particular issue. So who would like to start? Rafe, rather, sorry. Yes, please, if you'll just unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Yeah. So a key theme that came out of that, I thought, was lots of great themes, of course, but a key theme was around funding and, you know, how the government policy statement, well, the funding system, the National Land Transport Fund and so on are allocated, and how we should be shifting that. I've long thought that was a fund that's pretty hard to scrutinize. It's really hard to extract from the published reports a good sense of what's being put into public transport and other modes, of course, and partly because of the stupid arrangements with funding, through Treasury grants and so on for rail. But just, leaving aside the technical difficulties of access and understanding, there seems to be a critical problem there in understanding the strategic implications of the funding envelopes and how they're growing or shrinking and so on. And that needs to be a lot more transparent. And of course, there needs to be a substantive reallocation towards public transport. I would have thought a very clear Ministry of Transport directional statement around that would help a great deal.
Thank you, Ralph. I mean, in terms of the funding issues, there's also the wider questions of implicit subsidies and explicit subsidies, and a failure to price emissions effectively, and so on, all of which affect the incentive structure in which decisions are being made by organizations, businesses, and individuals, etc. Who of the speakers would like just to comment on what Rafe has said, if anyone? You're most welcome. I know Ben has had to go, but Paul, Robert?
Yeah, if
Jim?
I can, so it's Paul, if I can sort of say something. I mean, we see
Yes,
this,
please.
we see this very much at the local level of the complications around funding. I mean, I use the example of the Taupo interchange, and I went and talked to the Taupo Council about this, and also talked to Intercity about it, and they're all passing the buck, and I can sort of see why. So the Taupo Council says, you know, a significant number of the passengers coming through are not stopping in Taupo. I mean, they might be buying goods and services on the stop. So we don't want to pay for it. Intercity doesn't want to pay for it because those private companies will try and push the cost, you know, naturally to someone else. And the government won't pay for it because it simply doesn't know about it. You know, it just doesn't have the information. So you have, and what you see is where it works really well is it works well through a push through tourism. For example, the Franz Joseph little bus interchange, which is opposite the cafes. Now that came through a tourism fund. So where people see the direct thing, they can go to a specific fund, but it's like fighting for crossings for cycle tracks. You end up fighting each individual case. So that's why we need the overall network to say, look, you know, these are things that we need to do in each town, each city. Yeah, so that's all I've got to say.
Well, thank you, Paul. Robert?
Can I throw that one back on you, Rafe? Because this question about urban form was raised earlier. There's an example in my mind where they're proposing to build 4,500 houses and live in. And of course, the motorway, the houses are actually going to be on the other side of the motorway, which hasn't even been consented yet, but of course it's likely to be built. And this will lead to a lot more car traffic out of the region. So they're consulting with the locals in Levin about this new project, but the impacts will be felt far outside their region. What's a model where transport decisions and urban decisions can be joined up in some way?
Rafe, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I mean, that's, you know, there's been quite a lot of lip service to the integration of transport and urban form or urban planning, if you like, but not a huge amount of it actually done. And I did comment in one of, you know, the chat things earlier, that there's a massive, it's a very good Auckland blog. I think it was Matt Lowry, did quite recently about the massive expansion of Auckland in various directions, sprawling away over lots of new land. And, you know, of course, when you plan more arterials and build more roading and don't really develop the public transport network sufficiently to go with that, you've set in stone a pattern of urban development that's very car dependent. And we see that regularly all over New Zealand, especially in the tier 1 cities as they're described under the National Policy Statement on Urban Development. But the problem is that, you know, we're locking in a pattern of carbon emissions, which we're unlikely to be able to shift within the crucial period that James Renwick described at the beginning. And so, you know, we're sort of building the wrong shape of cities. I don't want to hijack the discussion onto this alone, but, you know, with Levin and with all these peripheral urban development issues and urban expansions, the crucial thing is to have enough rail going to these places and, you know, really good quality and coach services as well, you know, very accessible ones, and a sort of coherence of planning around that, it seems to me, from the Ministry of Transport through to, you know, HUD, the new Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, those two working together. Waka Kotahi very much linked into that, and they are doing some good thinking about urban development, but it's quite incipient, you know, it hasn't been developed very much. All those things working together very well and very effectively so you can get a really good public transport network in place as the cities expand and develop.
Thanks, Rafe. I'll just make one brief comment and then I'll go to David Larson. I'm not sure who David Larson is, but we'll come to you shortly. But just to simply say, having been on a road trip to visit relatives in New Plymouth, Auckland, Hamilton, and so on just over the last few weeks, sort of with forced holiday from the university, I've just been very conscious of the amount of urban sprawl that one sees in many small and larger centres across New Zealand, whether it's Taupo or Hamilton or New Plymouth, etc. Low density housing, you know, in many cases using valuable land that could be much more productively used for agriculture and so on. Anyway, the challenge there is, of course, partly NIMBYism with respect to urban density, isn't it? And the power of those who own valuable inner city properties to stop increased density. David Larson, I'm not sure, sorry, who you actually are, but you have your hand up, so you're next, and then I'll go to Darren Davis.
I'm not even sure who David Larson is, and I have no idea why it says it's David Larson on my thing. So my name's Adam, Adam Weller, and it's all been fantastic. Question in regards to Heidi's presentation around, because often we need to get solutions. If we could get a network in place, which is what Heidi was referring to, I was curious on who people think should be running that. Should that be an NZTA running network, i.e. setting up, making sure that there's facilities for bus networks and so on throughout the country? Or I noticed in the chat, someone saying a new agency should be created to run the network per se. Curious who people think, who should be responsible, and if it's come under the MOT, and how we get the new minister to maybe look at how we can progress that. Because it seems a reasonably easy thing to do, reasonably quickly, but no one's taking ownership.
Right. So, David, there's a variety of issues there, which include integration in relation to funding, in relation to digital services, in relation to just the whole planning of the networks and so on. So, Heidi, do you want to respond to that?
Sure.
Yes,
I think in the short term, I would say it would be an NZTA thing, because I think they need to set up a public transport activity class for this. But this brings in the wider question of what NZTA are good at, and they are really good at building roads. And I actually think they'd be better off split off with a new agency alongside, which is for all the sustainable modes. And then the size of them can be adjusted according to the country's direction it's going in. So there are a number of reasons why it would be good to get sustainable transport out of NZTA. It's, you know, we're not in the situation we're in now because of just, how do I put this? There's the political economy of car dependence, and most of that is a whole lot of people doing what they do, which isn't particularly wise, but it's not particularly bad. It's just people doing what they do, shoveling this political economy of car dependence forward all the time, supporting each other. And then there are a couple of black spots where there is actually support for the fossil fuel industries and the automotive industry. And I would say that traffic modelling and transport investment in evaluation is one of those places where there's a bit of a black spot. So I think it'd be great to get sustainable transport out of the NZTA for that reason.
All right, thank you, Heidi. James, I wondered if I could just move to you just to ask, you may or may not be able or willing to comment on this, but to what extent the Climate Change Commission in its thinking about the need for rapid decarbonisation over the next decade has thought about some of the integration issues, if I can put it that way, that have been raised by many of the speakers over the last hour or so.
Very good question, Jonathan, and I knew somebody was going to ask that. The short answer is yes. So things are being worked on still, obviously, but you know the clock's ticking. The draft advice will be out for public consultation on the 1st of February, so that's not too far away now. And yeah, transport's a big part of the story for obvious reasons, as discussed today. And a lot of ideas that we've heard about today are in the mix. You know, the actual form of the recommendations that will come from the Commission yet to be decided to a certain extent, but yeah, obvious things like the pumping up the public transport and integrating transport systems and electrifying the vehicle fleet, all of those things are definitely going to be part of the story, yeah.
All right, thank you. Darren, if I can come to you now, please go ahead.
Kia ora tātou. Really great set of presentations. I really appreciated it. So thanks to all of the panelists. So I think what you've come up with is, I think in urban public transport, we've probably got better over the last couple of decades, particularly in the largest New Zealand cities. From what it would seem is that regional and long distance public transport is just an utter dog's breakfast in this country, not to put too fine a point on it. They're completely down to, regional councils and, what they might provide and provide subsidized within regions. Interregional public transport, at least theoretically, is not eligible for funding out of the National Land Transport Fund, which ends up with odd situations of buses from Nelson to Richmond running in 2 regions, or from Pukakui to Tuakau, or stuff like that you have to have these bizarre arrangements. So completely kind of take that point on board, and interested first any comments on how we get past that. And I know there's been some comments about having some sort of national coordinating organization, but there's a lot of work to do on the ground. The second one, and it kind of falls out of this, is I work in a consultancy and I do a lot of work on public transport planning across the country. And if you put an equity or a deprivation lens over the current provision of public transport in New Zealand, you'll find almost an inverse relationship between deprivation and public transport access. Then by that I mean that the more affluent you are, generally the better public transport you get. And that deprived communities generally, often at the urban periphery, get poorer public transport. And I presume that would apply not just within urban areas, but across the entire country. So how do we address that sort of divide? We've got a situation in New Zealand of fast-growing cities, medium-growth cities, and frankly, places that are zombies, towns that are really, and communities that are really, really struggling. And I really take the point about the role of public transport in providing for both social inclusion, but also for revitalisation of those places. So any thoughts from anyone would be much appreciated.
Thanks, Darren. A number of important issues there. I just wanted, Thomas, would you be interested in commenting on that, or any of the other speakers?
Thanks, Jonathan. Maybe not specifically on that, but I guess I'm listening and thinking that often when we're thinking about what we want is some kind of significant political change, right? We have a setup in the country which massively prioritizes roads and individual car transport, and trucks for freight. That's what we've got, and aviation, right? So we want, and in order to get from that point to the other points which we like to see, we have to have some very significant political change, right? So that's what we need. We have a political change problem. I actually don't think we have particularly a let's work out the detailed policy issues problem, because that's kind of easy, I actually think. And Ben, from the MOT, people were kind of dumping on him in the comments, but frankly, he's probably one of our biggest allies in the public service and in the Ministry of Transport. He would probably like to have a massive, rapid transition to trains. So I kind of think it's, for me, this might be an annoying thing to say, but the most important focus of energy for all of us probably is to get people to make noise politically about whatever the issue we want might be. For me, I think a really good pinch point is going to be rail, transition to rail. Now, look at housing, right? the government has a massive mandate. We've got the most popular Prime Minister ever in the world universe ever. And she's not going to do anything about housing, really. She's going to say, no, I think it's good that housing prices continue to go up because most people think that house prices should continue to go up. She literally said that. So that is a political problem. And if she stood up tomorrow and said, actually, we're gonna completely move away from motorways and get everyone on trains, then her focus groups, and her targeted polling would explode, and she would not do it. So if we want the trains, same as we want housing changes, if we want trains, we need to massively organise to ask for them, to demand them, and otherwise all the brilliant policy ideas just kind of mean nothing. And I think that we can do that, and I think there are some specific areas that we can push on and organise around to get there. But I guess that's a challenge for all of us to work out how we're going to do that organising.
Yes. Thomas, can I say, because you're involved, in local government as an elected official, while we need obviously public pressure from individuals, from public sector organisations, civil society organisations, and so on, we also need you folk in the local government sector who care about these matters to be organised across the local government sector as a whole, so that there is pressure coming from a wide range of sources. Is not that the case?
Oh, totally. And in many councils, we're a million miles away from that. In many councils, they're dominated by people who are basically bitumen swilling road enthusiasts, and so we're not there. In the Wellington Regional Council, we've probably got a relatively progressive majority, I would say. So most things are going to be good. But then we've got a huge layer of the public service in our council and in all other public service organisations in the entire country that is used to doing things in a certain way, in a kind of neoliberal, extractive, capitalist economy, which is run on roads and cars, and that's quite difficult to shift. I mean, it takes time, and you could have great politicians who wanted to move, but so. I'm not trying to pass the buck here. I have to do better. We all have to do better as elected officials. One thing I would say is get progressive people who like trains and public transport to run for council. Yeah. Sure. Hardly anyone runs for council. There are a significant number of council seats in the country that are elected unopposed. Yeah. People just turn up and they just get elected. So good point. Let's get elected. Let's get people on there, and let's massively push for public transport. Yeah, no, all good. And I'm rather hoping that when James's Commission's report comes out in early February, the stark reality of the carbon budgets that will be evident will helpfully shock public opinion somewhat and help mobilise the kind of change we need. Now, look, Jonathan, I've got another David Larson. That's
the plan, Jonathan.
Yes,
and
yes.
Just to reiterate, so this thing comes out for public comment for 6 weeks from the 1st of February. Everybody needs to comment, absolutely. Because as Rod Carr said at a meeting recently, we're bound to have got it wrong. So we need to hear why it needs to be changed and how.
Well, I hope it's not too wrong, James. All right, now I've got another David. Yeah, sure. I hope. I've got another David Larson, who I think is different from Adam. So if you would like to unmute and ask a question, and then we'll come to Chris. Is there another David Larson with a question, with a hand up? No. All right. So we go to Chris. Chris McKellar.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Look, this. Firstly, about this whole public transport situation, we've got to decommercialise the public transport. At the moment, public transport is a service. It should not be be run on a commercial basis, where regional councils have to start looking at fare box returns. Public transport has got to be subsidised, and there are, especially here in the Waikato Regional Council, it's all about trying to save money. It's all about to reduce services to save money, because we don't want to keep going to NZTA to get extra funding for public transport. And this is the reason why I'm a really, really keen advocate to get a national public transport agency established, very similar to what Transport New South Wales has done, but more so using the Public Transport Victoria's model. My version of this, of the New Zealand version, would be under the Ministry of Transport, a separate state entity, that its sole role is to take over the procurement, planning, and funding of all public transport across all 16 regions within New Zealand. We've got regions in New Zealand that don't have public transport, but ratepayers, or sorry, taxpayers in those regions through fuel taxes are actually funding public transport for Auckland, Wellington. What we need is to do standardise, because currently regionalised funding, it doesn't work. It's very, very the cost is high. A lot of regional councils don't have the budget, and I know here in the Waikato Regional Council, I know that Auckland Council has got similar issues. We've got the Greater Wellington Regional Council have got funding issues. But if we bring it back under one state entity, state governments do actually have better bargaining power when you're dealing with overseas suppliers of trains and buses, and to me, it just doesn't take a rocket science to figure this out, because, you know, to reintroduce regional rail back into New Zealand, we're going to have to convince Kiwi Rail. Kiwi Rail owns the track. Current policy of Kiwi Rail is saying, no, we want the track for our freight services and our scenic trains. But who is going to say to Kiwi Rail, well, hey, listen, let's get regional trains back again? Who's going to say that? If we had a national public transport agency to say, yes, this is what it is, go to Kiwi Rail and say, hey, we want to use the track. How much are you going to cost charges to run regional rail? The government also needs to stop treating Kiwi Rail as a money-making machine. The national track infrastructure should be actually separated out, like they've done in Victoria, where they've got Vic Rail, and that whole track infrastructure is then separated, once again being another state entity under the Ministry of Transport, that is an open access track. That means anybody who wants to run a train service can actually operate within the National Rail Network. The National Rail Network is grossly underutilised. And, you know, we keep talking about this, but nothing really happens. Anyway, that's my personal views on that.
All right, Chris. Well, thank you. There's actually quite a few different points there. Who would like to comment? Again, Thomas or Heidi, Robert?
Yeah, I definitely agree that the operation of the track should be separated from the operation of passenger rail. I mean, Kiwi Rail is not really interested in passenger rail, and I can't see it being interested in it really in the future. I think, I'm not sure about a national public transport agency. I'm not against it. It might take quite a while to set up. And one of the things that you have is regional councils, they might get a bit like protective of their turf, you know, for better or worse. I'm not saying I would, but so that might be a little tricky to actually get in place. I think I probably want to do some stuff more quickly that you don't have to have a massive restructure for. But I think we should. I think you're right that we should think about the restructuring of passenger rail. It's very important.
Thanks, Thomas. Anyone else want to comment on that?
Yeah, I would just add. I'll be very brief. Everybody's talking about the carrots that would make everything better, but in other countries they also use the stick, and that's a problem for New Zealand, in that we just have no tradition of using disincentives like charges to get people out of their cars. If you look at the current pricing regimes for driving a private car in Europe, it's just completely off the charts compared to anything that could probably be put in place in New Zealand at the moment. So somehow, we're basically making it very difficult for ourselves. So somehow I think that should be included as well.
Absolutely, Robert. I think that's a crucial point in terms of the incentive structure for individuals and businesses and so on. Now, look, I've had one or two people ask me, how do you put your hand up? Could Peter Dowden, you're next. Can you just tell people how you put your hand up?
Yes, you can do it like this in front of the camera, and also
yes.
you can. It says raise hand or lower hand.
But you have to go into participants. If you click on participants at the bottom of the...
you click on participants, that's right. So that's right. Thank you, because I'd forgotten. If I click on participants, I don't need to raise my hand. I can't. All right, Peter, go ahead, or Alex.
Well, I sort of like the idea of a national public transport service, but then if maybe that should be sort of a public transport version of NZTA. I'm a bit worried that if you make a public transport version of, if you make a completely nationalised public transport network, all the places that currently have really good public transport will end up getting theirs kind of pushed down to the average. And yeah, it'll be great for Westport and Otaki, but it might make Christchurch's or Hamilton's public transport get worse. So that'd be a bit of a worry. Now, I think that the places that have the most wonderful public transport, or the most improving public transport, which in New Zealand might be Auckland, and then famously in Britain might be London. It's something to do with the fact that you can sack Boris the mayor, or you can sack Phil Goff the mayor, if you don't think the transport is very good. In Dunedin, people blame our local mayor when the public transport is bad, but in fact, it's not the Dunedin City Council's responsibility. It's run by this organisation no one's ever heard of called the Otago Regional Council. And but at least, and so to some extent, I feel that if most of the time when people get on a long distance coach, it's to travel somewhere within their region, then maybe regional councils should be the main agency for promoting regional transport, such as that operated by Intercity and Skip and some of those other companies. Then I feel, well, Dunedin to Christchurch is a pretty big transport market, and that is across two regions. So I don't have a really good answer, but I do like to mention to people whenever I get a chance that we used to have this famous nationwide travel company called Intercity, and yes, I hear you all say, oh, well, we've still got it, but actually Intercity used to run trains and buses. But it was what was called the Passenger Business Group of the New Zealand Railways Corporation, but then they separated the trains off and called that, Scenic Journeys or whatever it's called this month. They seem to change it quite often. And then Intercity coaches were separated off as well. Perhaps to do it better now would be to set up a national long distance transport booking agency that didn't actually attempt to sort of take over all the services, but maybe just ran a clearinghouse for booking tickets on them. And a bit like Google Transit. You might use something like Google Maps to plan a journey from my house in Dunedin to, say, Jonathan's house or Paul Callister's house. And then you could just sort of click something and it would take you to the site where you could actually basically do all of the ticketing in one go. And even if it was competing coach and bus and train services all the way. And then just before I go, I'd really love to see, as I've been harping on in the comments all afternoon, all morning, I'd really like to see Kiwi Rail just simply fill up its seats. So, don't spend billions of dollars on more trains just yet, but how about just filling up the empty seats on your existing trains in the same way that Air New Zealand would never allow a plane to fly half or even 3/4 full. We should have all our trains running to capacity, and if you make 10 people pay $108, and instead of that you have 100 people paying $10.80 to travel on the Dora the Explorer, then you'll sell a lot more in the snack bar and you'll make more money. It's as simple as that. And yeah, Air New Zealand would never allow empty seats to that extent. That'll do.
All right. Well, thank you. Again, a range of issues there, some of them about institutional design and the pros and cons of different ways of organizing things. Some specific issues about booking systems, the digital integration. Again, Heidi, you commented on that previously. Do you want to comment on that now?
Yes, I agreed with everything you said there, and I don't think there's any need to privatise operators. One of the posts that Paul and I wrote was about a history of long distance buses in New Zealand, and it really showed that in a place like New Zealand, we've never gone for a complete monopoly by the state. We've never, you know, you can choose to go completely state-owned, or you can go completely commercial, and there are pros and cons of both. So I don't think the first thing that we should ever try to do is try and bring it all into one place. There's lots of low-hanging fruit we can do to help coordinate it, and that's the best thing to be doing now as you talk. I was also wanting to suggest another really low-hanging fruit, which is the overnight train, because that doesn't require the upgraded track. So it's something we can do really quickly, and there are lots of different ways to, lots of different markets for that, and it would bring ridership up and cut a whole day of travel for anyone who's spanning both islands, which makes holidaying by train from Auckland or the North Island down to the South Island, you know, practical. So I think that's something that we need to push as well. And I just wanted to also respond to what Thomas said, although unfortunately I think he's gone now, about the public pressure, because we've been putting public pressure on for a long time, and we are making gains at the moment, but it's not going to be enough for the speed that we need to move. So there needs to be something else to complement with the public pressure. Yes, everybody needs to do their part, but the one missing thing is actually the legal situation. And I don't mean a whole lot of litigation, but what I do mean is people need to be able to lay out quite clearly to all the different layers of government and all the different people involved what their legal obligations are, hopefully without legal cases, but it might take a few legal cases to make this really clear. So that, because at the moment we've got councils and road controlling authorities and so on, only listening to those vocal minority voices. I think it's those are the people they see themselves as, or something. It's a legal conservatism. But if they were to see a threat of action for not taking steps on public health, on climate, on equity, and so on, then they can start putting things into a more balanced framework.
Okay, so we need a better regulatory framework, stronger, if you like, legal rights and responsibilities.
Yeah,
and the public, yes,
and the public pressure needs to include reference to this.
Yes, sure. Now, I'm conscious of time. We've got about 5 minutes before we need to wrap up for 12 o'clock. And we've had a pretty good sort of feast of material so far. Raina, you've got a question, so or a comment to make, so we'll take yours, and then I thought I'd just give the contributors an opportunity to speak for a minute or so, if they wish to kind of reinforce any particular points they want to, or address any matters that they feel haven't received adequate attention. So I know we've lost Ben, and I think we've lost Thomas, but the other four contributors are there. So Raina, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thank you for the presentation. Very, very interesting to hear. After listening to everybody, I mean, we can see we all determined that there is a lot to do in New Zealand, and we determined that we require some political change. Now, I'm a pragmatic realist, and the fact is we are a car society, sadly. And I think political change requires populist movement, and that won't be the case. So my question really is, what can be done to facilitate what we discussed today? Because obviously the key is our administration in Wellington. We need to convince some leaders, because what this country needs is leadership, not doing what the people want because they want to drive cars. I mean, that's a fact. We need a leader who looks beyond that, and talking about the legal framework, like Heidi talked about it, who is determined to fulfill our Paris Climate Agreement requirements. Because I mean, that is a legal framework too. We have to do a bit more than not doing anything and build more roads. So my question is, what can really be done to get all this going, what was mentioned today? Because I mean, that's the easy one, to understand the technology, to understand that there is a network requirement, all those things. But I think the big step is to get politicians on board, and the populism won't work. We need a leadership. Thank you.
All right, Rainer, look, thank you. Who would like to respond to that? And in the context of having a new Minister of Transport, Michael Wood, who is a thoughtful person, but not probably an expert in transport. James.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks for the question, Rainer. Quite right. I'm hopeful there is some leadership emerging in government. And the Zero Carbon Act, which has been enforced now for over a year, sets the framework in New Zealand for action on climate change. So when the Climate Change Commission's advice is tabled next year, the government is required to respond. And actually, even though the advice will be a bit delayed, they still have to respond by the end of the year, next year. And I know James Shaw is keen to push on this. It's a little bit hard to tell exactly, what the mood of cabinet is in general, but at this stage, I'm reasonably hopeful that we are going to see some action happening. But I'm not in the inner circle politically, so we'll have to wait and see, I guess.
All right. So a number of people have emphasised the critical importance of politics in this context, and political economy, and the fundamental question: how do we get political change? Can we just leave that there? And can I just, in the last couple of minutes, just say to the contributors, the speakers, if you would like just to offer a few brief reflections now to wrap things up, here's the opportunity. So Paul, Heidi, James, and Robert, any final reflections? Starting perhaps with Paul.
Yeah, I mean, my one thing I'd like to see happen in 2021, and it's a very small thing, but get a decent intercity bus depot in Auckland. We've been writing to people for about 5 years about this. It's doable, and if we can't do that, we can't shift all the other things. So it's grand to talk about the restructuring of NZTA and all those sort of things. But we've really got to do some small practical things that would actually help. So yeah, that's my big plan for 2021.
Right. Well, thank you, Paul. I think you've really highlighted, the critical importance of small steps as well as the big design issues. So thank you for that, Robert.
I'll reply to Rainer's point. My impression is that James Shaw and Jacinda Ardern are pragmatic realists, and that the Labour Party probably did go as far as they could go in the last election in terms of putting in a large number of small things to cut emissions, and that they did actually risk a backlash if they'd gone further. So as a realist, yeah, they do have to be careful, and once we've got those things bedded in, then we can do something else. That's basically the only practical way forward I can see.
Thanks, Robert. And I guess realism means you have to take account of the political wind, and part of the challenge here is how do you change the political wind? And I guess I hope the Climate Change Commission will be a contributor to that. And with that in mind, James, did you have any final comments? And then I'll finish off with Heidi.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. Just quickly, I'd like to thank everybody. I found this a really interesting discussion. I've taken a lot of notes, and it's heartening to know that, the discussions at the Commission and what's shaping up in the draft advice lines up with a lot of what's been said here. So yeah, thanks everyone, and look forward to hearing your comments on the Commission's work next year.
Thanks, James. Thanks for all that you've been doing too, publicly and privately, in your various capacities. So all the best for the coming months. Heidi.
Well, thank you, everybody. I've really enjoyed this too. I guess one last thought is if everyone could remember not to accept the myths being stated without challenging them. So we don't have data available. So the myths about we're too sparse a country to have public transport can be easily challenged. The myth that everybody drives can be easily challenged. No, actually, more than a quarter of us don't, and many more people don't want to on the open road. So that's really my last parting thought. But I suppose the other one is that the Climate Commission has looked at the whole emissions situation as from a long-term view first, end of century emissions, what we need to do for that, and then worked back from there to decide what we can do now that's in line with that also helps with our 2030 emissions. And that, I think, is a really critical thing to remember. We need to be setting up for the long term. That means our cities and our towns must not sprawl, full stop. What can we do now to make sure that doesn't happen? And then we work out what the emissions changes for 2030 from that, not the other way around. Yeah, thanks.
Easier said than done, Heidi. But look, thank you, everybody.
That's actually quite easy.
Well, yes, the political economy of this is the challenge, Heidi. Yes, so the technical side of it is probably quite straightforward. Look, first of all, a big thank you to Paul for setting this up. Paul has put a lot of work into coordinating with the various contributors and organizing things. So thank you, Paul. A really important area of activity in relation to trying to address this enormous challenge of climate change, and transport really for New Zealand in terms of carbon dioxide emissions is at the center of that challenge. So thank you very much. Thank you to the other contributors for your presentations and so forth. We'll try to make sure that they are available on the IGPS website. The recording will be available on the IGPS website in due course. Thank you to all the people who have asked questions and who have contributed to the chat session. I know there's a wealth of expertise among the people who have zoomed in today, and it's been great to see the very thoughtful comments in the chat session, though I appreciate I haven't had a chance to contribute to that myself. Lots and lots of issues ongoing. Obviously, the next few months is going to be pretty critical as we await the Climate Change Commission's climate change budgets, emission budgets, and the advice on how to achieve those budgets. So I think we're all going to be required to be fairly active in the next little while, even more so perhaps than has been the case hitherto. A critical time for New Zealand. So thank you all. Just as final comment, I don't think I've ever seen so many David Larsons, but I'll tell David that he's how kind of a very popular figure in Zoom. And with that, thank you everyone again, and let's hope we can continue this discussion in some way over the coming months.